whole lot of time on the EEG part and go really kind of straight to the physiological part. Just a few patterns just to summarize. Elevated beta, which we saw, simple blunted alpha, usually your low voltage fast phenotype. Elevated theta or alpha in the midline, often disassociative. Here's a low voltage example. This was actually Eroy John. This was a composite of 30 alcoholics, so it's not PTSD, but I show it. So if you ever see a map, if you're ever doing your cues and you see a map and you have a blue head and blue, 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 red, then you'll know what you've got.
Is this from the thumb drive? Do we have this?
This PowerPoint, yes you do.
Okay.
Yeah, I've saved it in a PDF for you. Another example of beta spindles. Again, these are really distinct frontal spindles. And I want to just go over a little bit. While it is true that every single PTSD brain will be different, it's a little bit like concussion. It's like, what's the pattern for concussion? Well, it depends on your mechanism of injury. Same for PTSD. It really does depend on the mechanism of the trauma and what resources you had or didn't have. But there are a few general studies. So Imperati in 2014 did this one. He looked at PTSD patients, noticing their findings were increased theta in the parietal lobes. He nicely gives us some Brodmann areas, also in the frontal lobes, and with connectivity we had alpha hyperconnectivity often. So we had some people had too much alpha. And what they theorized is that this had to do with the alteration of memory systems and emotional processing in the brain. So that's why they thought they saw that. There's one other study that looked at specifically connectivity, and this was by Terzic. This is actually the name of the paper up here, and I believe I put both of these in your thumb drive. Basically what they thought was hyperarousal was the reduced connectivity in the posterior superior temporal gyrus, and they thought that the personalization derealization severity was probably associated with the decreased connectivity they found in the perigenial anterior cingulate and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex within the anterior default mode network. That's the default mode network. The other thing they found is they found altered synchrony between the default mode network and components, and also between the default mode network and the central executive network. So a lot of disconnect, but also a lot of overconnect. Kind of goes both ways. Once again, it's hard to know what you're going to see until you get onto it. And the takeaway here is, let's look for several patterns, because probably you're going to see one or more. When I do my case study of RS, we'll talk a lot about his cue. He's got a lot of the nice features that you just summarized, so we can kind of actually see those. So I'm going to talked about EEG. I'm going to talk in more depth about the physiological findings, and then we're going to talk about neurofeedback and biofeedback interventions and how to implement those and integrate those along with therapies like brain spotting or EMDR or other trauma-based therapies. It's really going to be putting it all together. So physiological findings, when we look at doing a psychophysiological stress assessment, I'm looking at people who have cold hands. They come in your office, you shake their hand, and cold. Those are really easy to see. Paradoxical temperature change is another one that we'll see when we start looking at stress assessment, and I'll cue up a few of these in just a second. And muscle activation, so one or more areas is hyperactivated. And then variability in skin conductance. Now, skin conductance is interesting, because sometimes physiologically you'll see people that you just kind of do this. Skin conductance goes zzz, and sometimes you'll see people and they're a flat line. I wish that I had saved the sample of the kid that was talking about the gang shooting, and I was watching his skin conductance as he did it, and it was just flat as he was talking about pulling the trigger. And I'll show you a picture of that. And of course, heart rate variability being disorganized. So let's take a look at that in real time rather than just on the slide here. apologize. I had all that queued up before my computer decided to be misbehaving to me. All right, so. All right. We'll start out with the stress assessment here. We'll just kind of illustrate those. You guys seen these before? Most of you? Hands up if you have. A couple, handful. Okay, so good some people. So temperature. This is your typical finding in stress. The cold hands, and you get stress. You are basically shunting the blood from your capillaries, getting ready to flee or run. Your fingers and toes don't need it. Your reproductive organs don't need the blood. Your heart, your big muscles need it. It's I like the line from Robert Sapolsky. He always says, reproduce later. We got to run now. So this is the common finding physiologically. But the other common finding physiologically is if you go through a stress assessment, and just to kind of summarize what we're looking at, this is a resting baseline. This is a color-word Stroop type test that's timed. Another resting baseline. This is mathematics. Another rest. This is a stressful event recall, and then another rest. But sometimes you'll see people go through this whole series, and they'll start here, and all through this, their hands will actually warm up, and that's called paradoxical temperature change. When you have that, it's helpful to have assessments like the DSS, which is a dissociative assessment, on board, because you really you're suspecting some disassociation here when that happens. Same for the flat line with the skin conductance. You're really suspecting some disassociation. This person has really nice reactivity here. And it doesn't quite go down the baseline. This is actually a college student who had a math phobia, so this was not a PTSD person. Let's go look at one that is. All right, so this is an entire session. This is your reactive PTSD, and you can see this kid. This kid was sexually abused. And unfortunately, on my case studies, I was kind of looking to see different case studies to bring to you guys today. I kept looking at sexual abuse. There's a lot of that. So you guys see, this kid ramps up from. He's already pretty sweaty. Here's 10 microsiemens right here, right? And look where he's ramping up to almost 20. So he's more, he's really ramping up. On things like this, it's important to look at the percentage of change, not necessarily the numerics. So it's all proportional to the fact that, a small stimulus just kind of sends him through the roof. This is the kind of kid that you accidentally drop a pencil or someone closes the door, and that's what his response is. All right, so paradoxical temperature change we talked about, skin conductance we talked about, and deregulated heart rate variability. I'm going to show you a quick composite of that, and then Santiago's going to talk about heart rate variability. Let's go to this stress. We're going to talk about this one quite a lot, but I'm going to just show you her initial stress test. Not that one. So heart rate variability, we start talking about problems with heart rate variability, holding your breath, really disorganized here. We'll talk about what's happening with this event here.
Where do you have those sensors on the shoulders?
What's that?
The
Yeah.
EMG on top?
Yeah, traps.
Traps?
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, even at the beginning.
At least she's even left, right?
Well, actually.
A little bit more on that,
Yeah,
but if
she's
it's at the
gonna do
right.
this. Yeah, a little bit. But real disorganized, heart rate variability. You really kind of see, I love doing stress assessments with people because you can really start to see where they express their stress and plug in what your therapies in terms of biofeedback are going to be. And you can see she's real reactive too. Really, the really seriously disorganized HRV, especially in this area here, doesn't look at the breath, look at the intermediate interval of the heart, and how different it is. So that's the other piece of the physiological network that we look at when we start to do stress assessments with CPARs.
Is that the tell me your traumatic event or tell me a stressful event?
What's that?
Is that the stressful event? Right
It
there?
is. It is. And I'm going to go through a whole case study looking at stress assessment here in just a minute. I'm going to let Santiago talk about heart rate variability. I'm going to flip back and go through kind of the whole stress assessment piece. But yeah, that's significant. Go ahead. You want to, at the risk, I'm going to disconnect my computer.
Well, you're going to have to. Wait, wait, wait.
Here, I'm just there you go.
Oh, set it down myself.
Oh, okay.
So I got to find a couple slides. All right, so in my practice, the very first thing I do after I've done the assessment, and my assessment consists of a 19-channel QEEG and stress profile, trauma assessment, and then we do the interdisciplinary work, which I will explain when I talk about that section. But the very first thing I start with is heart rate variability. It's my very first form of intervention. Okay? And it's my very first form of intervention because it's a way of reaching the brain from the bottom up. So it's a bottom-up approach. Okay? And when you do HRV biofeedback, you are priming the brain for posterior work with neurofeedback or psychotherapy or EMDR. Now, it's also the easiest one to learn usually for the client. In my experience, clients will learn to regulate and achieve good coherence and good heart rate variability within 3 sessions, even if they're highly traumatized. Okay? It takes practice, but they can do it. Okay? And this is an image from WinEEG. WinEEG is a very useful software that will also allow you to use WinHRV. So what you can do is you can measure the EEG and the HRV profile at the same time. And that's something that I do. So when I do the QEEG, I'm also measuring heart rate variability. And I look at the interbeat intervals as to how they relate to brainwave activity. If the client is normally doing constriction or dissociation or is hypervigilant, we're going to have very close IBIs. So the IBIs are going to be very close to each other. There's very little variability in the heart rhythm. So that tells me that they're dysregulated from a neurological and cardiovascular perspective. Now, the reason we do heart rate variability is because through the vagus nerve, we can reach the brain via different relay points. Okay? Now, the most important element and the only non-invasive way of achieving good HRV is through breathing. Okay? The other ones are through surgery or you do a pacemaker, things like that. But the only non-invasive way to achieve good HRV is through respiration biofeedback. Now, the key element in breathing is gas exchange. You're exchanging O2 for CO2, oxygen for carbon dioxide. Okay? And normally we're taught to believe that the oxygen is the most important. but the most important is going to be the CO2. Okay, every time we exhale, our brain is going to get a signal to inhale again. Okay, and it's because the CO2 gets depleted. Now, that exchange needs to be precise. If you have somebody doing on hypervigilance, they're going to be hyperventilating or they're going to be over-breathing. It means they're breathing over their normal or useful rate. Okay? And that's different for everybody. And what happens is you get depletion of the O2, the CO2, sorry. So you are exhaling and expelling more CO2 than you really need. Okay? Now, what are the really points? So we have the vagus nerve going from the heart to the brain, and our first really point is going to be the brainstem. Okay? And in the brainstem we have a structure called the medulla. Now, in the medulla, we're going to have chemoreceptors. So we have little receptors that respond to changes in CO2. So those chemoreceptors are programmed to respond to changes in CO2. Meaning when I exhale, this part of the brain is going to signal me to inhale again, so I don't die. Okay? If we're over-breathing, those chemoreceptors are going to think that that's our normal rate. Therefore, it's our healthy breathing rate. So if I'm doing 15 breaths per minute, 20 breaths per minute, 30 breaths per minute, which is really high, okay, those chemoreceptors are going to say, it's okay. Okay? And they send info to the limbic system or the amygdala. So heart rhythmicity, the way my heart rhythm is going to affect how my brain behaves. So if we have somebody who's traumatized, who's angry, who's depressed, who's anxious, who's forgetful, more often than not, their heart rate variability is going to be dysregulated, is going to be disorganized. If you watch a baby breathe, babies know how to breathe. They breathe through the diaphragm. They inflate and deflate the belly. But as we grow up and as we go through stress and trauma and life, we forget how to breathe. So we got to retrain and remember ourselves. And so what we're doing, we're affecting the limbic system and the amygdala. And the amygdala will share information with and connections with the frontal and prefrontal cortex. Now that's key because if we're over-breathing plus being anxious, plus being traumatized, plus being angry, what we're doing is we're going to have a really hyperactive amygdala. And some phenomenon known as the hijacking will occur. It means that the amygdala will hijack the ability for the frontal and prefrontal cortex to do their job. So if we have somebody who's really hyperactive, hypervigilant, we're going to have a lot of limbic activation. So the limbic tone is really high, meaning the limbic system is running the show. And their frontal cortex will not act accordingly. So they're going to react out of emotion as opposed to rational. So they're going to act and they're not going to think before they act. It's an impulsive reaction. And they're driven to being untrusting of everybody. They're driven to being angry. They're driven to being anxious. They're driven to being aggressive, whether it's physically, verbally, or both. Okay? So we really need to learn how to breathe to change the rhythmicity of the heart and then change the rhythmicity of the brain. And how is that impactful? Well, we have
What's up again?
here it is. So this is a recording using Win HRV and running the EEG at the same time. And if you see the salient feature for this person is the mu at C3. So this is somebody who has trauma and is undergoing dissociation. This person tends to dissociate a lot. Okay? And you see the alpha suppression in the back of the head. This is an eyes open recording. And you will see that they have a lot of sympathetic tone. Okay? The spectral analysis showing more sympathetic tone. So they're hypervigilant, but they're dissociating at the same time. Okay? And what I had this person do, and here's the spectral analysis. So the mu is at 10.50 hertz, and you can see the power spectrum at C3. So that's the most salient presentation for this gentleman. with a little bit of the background alpha rhythm being suppressed. So he's not producing a lot of alpha, which would allow him to emotionally self-regulate. Okay? And remember that the mu means there's a disconnection or dysregulation of the frontal cortex. So this person is dissociating, and the frontal cortex is not engaging from him. So executive functions, behavioral inhibition, affective regulation, that goes out the window. He doesn't know what that is. Meaning, if I ask this person to stress out, they're going to go, oh, sure, no problem. But if I ask them to relax, they're going to ask me, well, how do you do that? Okay, so they don't know because their nervous system has forgotten how to regulate. And what happened is I had them do 5 minutes of breathing. And here we go. So while he was hooked up to the Win EEG machine, you can see the QRX complex here, and you can see the IBIs, the end-to-end. And here's the mu at C3, and when he started doing coherent breathing, you can see the mu desynchronizing. So we're breaking the dissociation, and we're getting more frontal activation. So hypervigilance starts going down, dissociation starts going down. So he's more able to be in the here and the now. And how do you know? Well, because we're measuring it. And this was just 5 minutes of coherent breathing. Okay? If we measure a long time, we're going to probably be able to see more of the desynchronization and stabilization of the motor cortex, meaning more frontal activation. Okay? And this is his eyes closed EEG with the typical chart vertex wave that correlates with sleep disorder and stage 2 sleep. And if you see the IBIs, they're fairly close to each other. So his HRV is highly dysregulated. So not only is he not sleeping well, not only is he hypervigilant, not only is he dissociating, he's not sleeping well. So he's not achieving deep, restful sleep. Okay. And
Try shoving your plug in a little more.
there's something all the way. I think it's the cable.
Oh, you can take it out and put it back in.
There.
There you
thank you. Now, if you notice, when he's doing the breathing, not only is the mu desynchronizing, but the power spectrum is being reduced, and his IBIs, his beat-to-beat intervals, they start spreading out, which means better variability.
So now let's stop. Could you go back to that slide so I can see the circle
before
of
and the after. Oh, this one?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So usually, if you have a client who is sleep deprived or has some kind of sleep disorder, they will have a typical short vertex wave in their EEG. And what that means is as they're trying to progress deeper into the stages of sleep, when that happens, they're going to be waking up.
Right.
So there's some kind of mechanism affecting them. And it's followed usually by fast brainwave activity. So he's waking up and he's waking up really anxious. So it's just like Linda was saying, you drop a pencil and that person goes immediately on alert. It's jumping. So it's a very light sleep. Okay. And if you see the IBIs again, they're fairly close to each other. When you do the IBIs, the interbeat intervals, you want them to be spread out. So the more time that elapses between one heartbeat and the next, better. Now you don't want it to be exactly the same time. You want it to be different times. Because the more variable, the healthier the heart is. And when we had them breathe then, well, we were able to break that dissociation. And you can see the reduction in the power spectra. You can see the IBIs getting larger, more time between one another. And you get better health. So you're getting a healthier heart, and at the same time you're getting a healthier brain. So HRV is a really good tool to break dissociation. I use it a lot, and when the client is breathing, he's less prone to going into dissociation.
With HRV.
With HRV, as the first tool.
Yeah.
Right? And so what that is doing is priming the brain for the neurofeedback. So the brain is going to be more flexible, and the brain will understand what neurofeedback is all about. Sometimes when you go into neurofeedback straight out, the central nervous system feels like an assault. And you bring in this tool that's trying to calm me down, I am going to fight it back. Because usually the first thing is fight it back. With heart rate variability, not so much, because you're going from the heart to the brain. So you're using a relay point, okay? So that relay point really helps, okay? Now, the other thing is that not only you get better reduced limbic activation and more frontal cortex function, the hippocampus will produce something called BDNF. It's called brain-derived neurotropic factor, okay? And that's a growth factor. And it's a protein that helps us make more neurons. So if you're hypervigilant, you're producing cortisol. And cortisol kills neurons, especially in the hippocampus. Okay? So hippocampal reduction in neurogenesis is a big problem. If you're doing heart rate variability plus exercise plus other things, you get more BDNF. And BDNF has two effects. One is promoting and fostering neurogenesis, and two is going to neutralize the effects of cortisol. So the more BDNF, the more reduction and neutralization of cortisol effects you will have. Which means you start reducing the inflammation, reducing the hypervigilance, reducing the dissociation, reducing constriction, and you're moving towards more towards healing itself. And that's why I like using it so much. Okay? Now, do I use it alone? Yes. I start about 5 sessions of HRV alone. And what I do is I have the system, I record the pacer on the client's cell phone, and I send them home with the pacer so they can practice. So I find the resonant frequency, which means their optimal breathing rate. Once I find out it's 5 breaths per minute, 5.5, 6, 7, I train them with that, and then I send them home to practice. So they have to practice at home in between sessions. There's no other way around. And they like it so much that usually when I go to the waiting room to get my next client, I find them practicing before the session and so forth. So it really engages them into doing it. And people start reporting a reduction in anger, in hypervigilance, they feel more peaceful, they feel they sleep better, okay? And that's the reason why we want to use them. Now, then we get into the neocortex, okay? So that's the relay point, and we go through the thalamus, which is our subcortical to cortical relay. And the neocortex is where we do our advanced processing, okay? So language and creating technology and all of that, executive functions, a lot of that goes to this relay point. When we are doing heart rate variability, we're also optimizing neocortical function, which means we have reduction in attention, spacing out, drifting away. We are more prone to be more focused, okay? And we are doing network connectivity. So we're working with the cortex, but we're integrating areas of the brain. So we're not working on one particular region, because the brain is really an integration object. So what we're doing is we're integrating the brain, and we're getting to work a lot better. Okay? And what are the elements that contribute to that? And you're going to think that we have set up a really specific protocol for it, but it isn't the case. It's very, very simple and very straightforward. So I recorded myself in the past few days, remembering some of my traumas, and just remembering. So just to show what it does to heart rate variability. This is called a Biocom heart tracker. It's this sensor right here. It's pretty similar to the M-Wave, but I like it more than the M-Wave because the sensor itself is more sturdy, more robust, and the images that it provides are a little bit more nicer to look at. So if you want to pass it around and look at it, it's about the same cost of the M-Wave. It doesn't have any games. It's a very straightforward train. But
It's on the ear, right?
it's a pulse sensor on the ear. So this is me recording one of my traumas, and this is what the displays are. So it will show you your variability curve, meaning your heart rate as directed by your breathing. This is your spectral analysis, which this is your autonomic balance, your sympathetic tone, your parasympathetic tone, and it shows you your score. So this one here is low coherence, medium coherence, high coherence, and super coherence. And where you want to take the client, you want to take them to the green, as far as they can. Now, it's very important to understand what these means, okay? Because a lot of people buy these sensors because they're cheap, and their objective is to drive the client to the green. But they don't understand the physiology behind it. So they, in essence, some people might be doing more harm than good. Now, how many of you know what the spectral analysis means in heart rate variability? How many do not know? Okay. So I will explain that because it's important. We have your spectral analysis where we have the frequency in hertz, and this is power. We have 3 different components. So anything that goes between 0 and 0.1 is going to be your sympathetic branch. So anything that moves here is going to be your sympathetic branch being activated. Okay. If you are at 0.1, it means autonomic balance. Okay, so it means high coherence. It means homeostasis, regulation, peace, healing, joy, anything you want to use to describe it. And anything that goes from 0.1 to the right is going to be your parasympathetic branch. So it's very simple. I have the client come to the first session. Before I do the RSA, the resonant, the frequency, I have them breathe for 2 to 3 minutes. I don't show them the pacer, I just show them the screen, and I tell them, you're going to see a bunch of lines going up and down. Don't worry about it, I will explain what it means. They sit there, and for 2 to 3 minutes, I tell them just breathe how you know, the way you normally do. Okay? I'm not coaching them, I'm not telling them anything. And then I measure where they are. Okay? So in this case, and you want to look at the power. If the peaks are, you're going to have more of a tendency. People normally are going to be more in the sympathetic tone. Okay? For the most part, a lot of people are going to have sympathetic dominance. They're going to be hypervigilant, anxious, angry, etc., etc. Some people are going to have parasympathetic dominance, okay? Meaning they're going to be depressed, unmotivated, dissociating, have low energy. Okay? And the way I explain it is your sympathetic branch works as the gas in a vehicle. If you want to skate, you step on the gas and you drive as fast as you can and you get as far away as you can. Your parasympathetic branch is the brake. So when the threat is over, you want to step on the brake, nice and slow, come to stop and regroup. So some people are going to be in sympathetic arousal, meaning they're going to stepping on the gas all the time. If you're driving a car and you're stepping on the gas, at some point you're going to crash. Okay? When you crash, you're going to do it from 3 different perspectives. Physical, emotional, and psychological. Okay? And all 3 are directly related to one another. So the physical one is you get sick all the time, you get headaches, you get migraines, you get the flu, and it takes you a month to get over it. You develop an autoimmune disorder, you get inflammation, you have too much cortisol to no cortisol. Okay, so those physical manifestations. The emotional is, well, you're going to feel sad or angry or regret, or you're going to have regrets, you're going to feel guilt. And from a psychological perspective, we talk about how you perceive the world. So your perception of the world is going to go one way or the other. You're going to see the world as a dangerous place, as a threatening place. You're going to see it as a menacing place where people are not worth trusting. Everybody's out to get you, things like that. Or, the world is really sad. I don't want to live anymore. There's no point. I'm going to kill myself. So if you are in sympathetic tone, you're stepping on the pedal. We need to bring the brake. But if you have parasympathetic tone, it means you're stepping on brake and you're not going anywhere. You're stuck. Okay? That means you're unmotivated, you're tired, you're depressed, you're helpless. Okay? So what we want to do is teach the organism, we want to teach that autonomic nervous system how to step on the pedal when we need, step on brake when we need. And the way we do is through breathing. So as we inhale, our heart rate is going to speed up. It's going to go up. Why? Because we're activating the sympathetic branch. So If you put your fingers and you measure your own heart rate as you inhale, you're going to feel your heart beating a little faster. That's sympathetic. As we exhale, we're stepping on the brake and we're bringing down, and we're activating parasympathetic branch. So it's that coordinated inhaling and exhaling that brings that synchrony. It's just like when we're driving a car. Step on the pedal when I need, I step on the brake when I need. Okay? And the way we do it is by increasing two elements in particular, the depth and the frequency. Heart rate variability has 4 key elements. There's 4 objectives to HRV training. The first one is increasing the difference between your maximum heart rate and your minimum heart rate. Meaning, when you inhale, you want to accelerate your heart as much as you can, step on the pedal, and when you exhale, you want to decrease or reduce that heart rate as much as you can. So when you inhale, you want to go to 70, 80, 90 beats per minute, and when you exhale, you want to go 60, 50, 40 beats per minute. The larger the difference, the better. The healthier your heart is going to be, and the healthier your brain is going to be. Okay? Number 2 is increasing the SDNN, which is the standard deviation of intervals. Meaning, in essence, what you're doing is making sure that the time that elapses between one heartbeat and the other is maximized. That's what the SDNN is. Now, sensors like the Biocom or the M-Wave are not going to show you that. So they're not really fully HRV biofeedback in a way. If you want an equipment that's going to show you that, well, you have to go with Thought Technology or Nexus or Brainmaster, something that's going to show you that. And that's really important to show and have if you want to do research. You need the numbers, you need the data, okay? Because you need to compare and contrast. Now, number 3 is increasing the percentage of low frequency. So, when you look at advanced software such as the one Linda was showing us, or BioTrace, or any other good amplifier, you're going to see a percentage for high frequency, low frequency, and very low frequency. Okay? Sympathetic tone is your very low frequency percentage. Parasympathetic is going to be your high frequency percentage. And your autonomic balance is going to be your low frequency percentage. So that's why you want to increase that. Which is tied to objective number 4, which means getting a peak as high as you can on at 0.1 hertz. So, and that has to do with the frequency you breathe multiplied by the number of breaths divided by something else, okay? And I put an article in your handouts that explains that formula, how they arrived at that conclusion. Now, Stephen Elliott, in his book, The New Science of Breath, talks about going 5 breaths per minute, and it will take you not to 0.1, but it take you a little left to like 0.85 hertz. So for most people, the ideal breathing rate at rest is going to be 5 to 6 to 7 breaths per minute maximum. Anything over that is unhealthy, dysregulated heart rate variability. So that's why that's why I do it first, and that's why I suggest you do it first. Before you start any other modality, teach heart rate variability biofeedback. And you will see the difference in your interventions in the future. And you will see the changes moment to moment, right? Okay? So how do we change the maximum heart rate and the minimum heart rate? With the depth. The deeper you breathe, so the deeper your inhale is, the more you're going to accelerate the heart rate. And the deeper you exhale, the more you're going to decelerate your heart rate. So the depth of the breath, of the breathing cycle is really important. You want to make sure it's as deep as possible, but you want to keep them in coherence. Okay? And that has to do with their cardiovascular health, their fitness level, age, whether they have a condition such as hypertension or hypotension. So those things you have to keep in mind. And the other one is the frequency. The slower and the deeper you breathe, the better variability you're going to achieve. Now, most literature will say 5 to 7 breaths per minute. Okay, So at the low end, you're going to have people with really good cardiovascular systems, athletes, meditators, or people who exercise. So if you're trying to get a client who's unfit and who doesn't exercise, and you try to get them to go to 5 breaths per minute, it's going to be really difficult for them because they don't have the cardiovascular endurance. Okay? And normally athletes will have good heart rate variability from a physiological perspective. In mental health work, we talk about heart rate variability for behavioral and psychological purposes. We're increasing physical and medical health, but we're also optimizing brain performance. Right? Now, how do you do it? Well, you do the resonant frequency analysis. So you can start at 5 breaths and increase it to 7, or you can start at 7 and reduce it to 5. What that means, the client comes for the first time. You have them breathe at 5 breaths per minute, 2 to 3 minutes. You help them pause, and you look at the spectral analysis. If you have a peak at 0.1, meaning there's only green at 0.1, no orange to the right, no orange to the left, it means they can breathe at 5 breaths per minute. So that's their ideal breathing rate. Okay? If that's not the case, you go to 5. I increase it by 0.5, so I don't know how you do, but I go 0.5 to 0.5 normally.
Yeah.
So I go from 5 to 5.5. And I do the same thing. I look at the spectral analysis, look at all the displays, look at the data. Does it look good? Okay, maybe 5 to 5.5. If that's not the case, I go to 6, 6.5, 7. Okay? Now, some people might need to start a little higher, and that's okay. If they feel more comfortable at 9 to 10 breaths per minute, remember, that's where you start them. But I would say 95 to 99% of clients are going to, within 2 to 3 sessions, are going to be able to go to the optimal breathing rate. It's something that it's instilled in our organism. We just need to teach the organism to remember how to breathe. And the key element is the mechanics of the breathing. So breathing mechanics are very, very, very important. You have to teach them to breathe through the diaphragm, and their body has to be in a specific position. So we have time later for the practical. I will make more emphasis on that. Okay, but you as a practitioner, as a clinician, you have to be obsessed with being pretty much perfect when a client does it. Because if they learn how to do it the wrong way, it's going to imprint, and then reversing that is going to be really hard. So you have to make sure you have the mechanics right from the get-go. Okay? And the client will enjoy it. Very few clients have a hard time doing it. Most clients will have an easy time learning it. If the client has a hard time, well, you have to be patient. And you have to go for as long as it takes. The way I explain the process to my clients is we are going to go on stages or phases. It is not until you master one phase that we're going to move to the next one. So if they do not master heart rate variability, I don't do neurofeedback, brain spotting, or anything else. Okay? Once they master that, then we move on to the next stage. So it promotes motivation on the part of the client to get things right. And it also provides me with the ability to see how resilient and how tolerant they are to frustration. Once we go into neurofeedback, I start making it more difficult gradually, but it's not until they master the first phases that I move on to the next ones. Because I have to make sure the client knows how to do it, and I want to teach them how to do it right. Okay. So, any questions about this? Is that clear for you who didn't know how to read that and why we do it? Okay. Now, if there's something that you can do to ensure that your gas exchange is proper, and you can get a capnometer, because that will rate your CO2 dropping. So if you can get one, and there's really cheap ones in the market, right?
Not really.
Well, yeah.
1,000-ish.
Oh, it's not too cheap. But if you want to make sure that you're doing it right and you want to do solid research, you need a capnometer for that purpose. If that's not of your interest, you can get away with just heart rate variability very easily. And usually in trauma work, I combine heart rate variability with FP1 protocol. I would place a sensor at FP1 and train with the eyes closed. So when the client has learned how to do heart rate variability, I introduce that, and I use music for that. So I place the sensor at FP1, and that way I'm reaching the amygdala. So I'm cooling down the amygdala, and I'm allowing I'm reaching the limbic system, and I'm allowing the frontal cortex to start doing its job. So the client will starts with 5 minutes of high rate variability, and then I do about 10 minutes of FP1, eyes closed, with music. So I use relaxing music. If they're suppressing what I need to suppress, the music keeps playing. If they go the other way, I usually, the music shuts down, or I use an aversive tone, depending on what the client can tolerate. They do that for 10 minutes, divided in 2-minute chunks. So I go 2 minutes of hard work, they rest for a minute, 2 minutes of hard work, they rest for a minute, and then they go to high rate variability again. Okay, so I'm doing the bottom up, top down approach. And that protocol works really well for a lot of people because it reduces limbic hyperactivation, and the consequence for the most part, people can focus better, they can sleep better. It breaks down the hypervigilance for a lot of them. And it really works well for a lot of people. Sometimes it doesn't work, so I will do PZ, eyes closed, uptrain the alpha, suppress anything that's high, whatever the EEG is showing, because it's QEEG based, and then I combine it with high rate variability. And then I'll talk a little more about how to integrate the other aspects of that. But are there any questions before we move forward?
So could you repeat, when you do the FP1, I think you just went on to say it, what frequencies are you?
It depends on what's on the EEG.
Right.
But I do only a suppressed protocol. I don't tend to uptrain anything. Sometimes I will uptrain 11 to 14 slightly, because that's a little regulating for the client. But I normally down suppress everything, and I will down train. Usually the clients will show 15, 16 hertz and over that. So anything from 16 to 30, 35, whatever is shown in the EEG. And then the 11 to 14 sometimes is a little relaxing. I'm always talking to the client and noticing the reactions. So if I see that they're being more overreactive, I suppress, and I take down the 11-14 reward, and I just suppress it. And then I go to the heart rate variability. But I always start with HRV. So the breathing will prime the brain, it will go into neurofeedback, the heart rate variability, and then the neurofeedback. And it works really, really well. Sometimes if I'm doing eyes open CZ to T6, I create a screen on BioTrace where I have the pacer at the bottom of the screen, so they can do the breathing, and then at the top of the screen we'll have whatever feedback we're working with, either a movie or a video game or music, whatever the client's working with. And that works really well because it reminds the client how to breathe. And what it does is I teach them to focus on the breathing itself, not so much the pacer or what's going on. So they go into that autopilot that we need, and they start learning how to integrate the bottom up to the top down approach, and they're integrating the breathing with their EEG activity.
We probably need to go to all other therapies.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
So
we've got about 5 minutes before we have to
Okay.
go to case studies.
Good. So when we talk about integration, this is how I do it. I learned about functional medicine from that book I mentioned, Why My Brain Isn't Working. And I like functional medicine because one is evidence-based. So if you look at the research they have a ton of research. So this is not new era, new age thing. It's really evidence-based. And the other thing that I like, and the most salient feature, is that they go for the root cause of the problem. So they try to find what's causing the symptoms. It's not symptom treatment, it's not symptom suppression, it's what is causing the symptoms. Some of the things they look at, they do thorough testing. So they test for heavy metals, autoimmune, deficiencies, allergies, you name it. It can be pricey. It will be pricey. But it's well worth it. If your client can afford it, it is well worth it. And a lot of them, and I think any of them do insurance work, right? But most of them are independent practitioners. They include supplements, diet, and exercise. There's little to no medication, and they use supplementation. Okay, so that's one of the things that I really like about it. And so they will look for, among other things, vitamin B deficiencies, autoimmune disorders, inflammation, heavy metals. I've had clients with cognitive decline, and we find lead poisoning, mercury poisoning. There's heavy metals involved. So as much neurofeedback as I can do, we went on detox, we're not going to get anywhere. Okay? They do the gut-brain axis analysis. There's a lot of talk. If you haven't heard of the gut-brain axis, I recommend you read on it. There's new research that's showing that our serotonin is produced 90% in our gut, not our brain. So if we have a leaky gut, meaning there's stuff filtering out, our neurotransmitters, particularly our serotonin, is going to be dysregulated. They do food sensitivity testing. It's a body relation, and they look for thyroid problems, and it's an integrated approach. So every client that comes to my office has to do functional medicine, whether they like it or not. If they don't go through functional medicine, I don't see them. Okay? Because I'm not risking not being successful with my intervention. Okay? And most of the clients will be able to do it, and some of them can either get the test prescription from the functional medicine. They go to their insurance, and a doctor can transcribe it, so it's covered. So that's another option that they have. But it's a very interesting approach. This is a heavy metal poisoning testing that they do. Unfortunately, in Colombia, we don't have the equipment to do it, so most of the testing is sent here to the United States. But people will be able to afford it. And it will show you what the percentage of where each metal is. So if there's heavy metal poisoning, it will show. Okay, whether it's lead or mercury or any other one. Okay.
Copper's a copper.
Copper. Now this is a food sensitivity test. So really high, high, and not high. Okay, and it show you wheat is a big one, eggs is another big one for this person. So this person is really sensitive to wheat and eggs, oatmeal, and eggs. So in the meantime, we reduce what we do. The functional medicine practitioner, we reduce the intake of those foods to see if inflammation is reduced. So for some people it's temporary, for some people it might be permanent. But we find that when we do the food testing analysis and people go into a healthier diet, their brain gets better and their mental health gets better. So the correlation is there. There's no doubt about it. And those are the recommendations. So they do gluten sensitivity testing. So a lot of people are sensitive to gluten. They cannot consume any more gluten. So that's another big step. And I also use something called brain spotting. So I'm going to stop here for 2 minutes. Brain spotting is something I came across. I was called by a club in Guatemala who wanted me to go do some work on parental pressure on their athletes, on youth athletes. So I was doing some research and I came across a book by David Grant called This Is Your Brain in Sports. And the book is focused on trauma in sports. And he mentioned the word brain spotting. So I got really curious about it and I went to look for him on the internet. If you want to see a really good brain spotting demonstration, look for, there's a short documentary called ESPN 3430. It's called Fields of Fear. And it's about Mackey Sasser, the former catcher for the New York Mets, and how a problem that he developed ended up his career, and David does brain spotting with him. The premise is really simple. Where you look affects how you feel. And in brain spotting, what we do is look for eye positions that will access subcortical regions where the trauma is being held. Okay? And I want to show you a short video, that will help us understand what this is all about. So I'm going to play this very short, and it will. There we go. So I want you to pay attention to what's happening. So we got that scenario. Right, so you see what's happening. Now, I want you to focus your attention on what the antelope is doing to the moment it escapes, right? I want to fast forward to that, and I want you to pay really good attention to what it does. So anybody notice anything in particular? It gets up, it takes off. Pay attention to what it does between the time it gets up and takes off running. Yeah, it shakes the head, right? So that's called the healing response. And all mammals, including humans, have been embedded with that through evolution. So the antelope is apparently dead when the cheetah caught it, right? And they press on the trachea to suffocate the victim. What the antelope is doing is going through something called the freezing response. Meaning is going into a trance-like state to avoid suffering. So when death is imminent, mammals will go into a trance-like state to avoid the pain and the agony of being eaten alive. But if you see the hyena shows up, distracts the cheetah, and then as the hyena is going back, it gets up, it shakes, and it takes off, right? Now, the shaking is the key element. Meaning, during those 2-3 seconds, it's releasing the trauma. So 30 seconds later, an antelope is going to forget that a couple of minutes ago it was being eaten alive by a predator. Okay? And humans have that too. Now, in humans it's different because of our neocortex. When we're traumatized, we're going to process it. Okay? Lower mammals don't do that because they don't have such an advanced and complex cortex. But when we're traumatized, we try to make sense of things and we overthink it. And that's when we go into the trauma response. Now, with brain spotting or EMDR, we look to activate the healing response. Okay? And trauma work, it's all about energy. Trauma healing is all about energy. Okay? So normally a person will be trapped in this vicious cycle. You have the arousal or the event. You cannot escape. You experience helplessness. You're immobile, and then you go over and over and over and over. Right? So you're trapped in that full circle. But when you heal, you go from being a victim to being empowered. So the idea is to empower the client. Whether it's trauma or ADD or depression or peak performance. And it's all about energy. The removal, the evacuation, the liberation, the release, or the ejection. Whatever you want to call it, it's about getting rid of that energy. And by energy, I mean the physical, emotional, and psychological consequences of the trauma. Okay? Illnesses that you go to the doctor for and they cannot diagnose because they don't understand. Being angry all the time, being upset, being resentful. Okay? And the psychological is how you perceive it. So with brain spotting, we can do it. So how does the brain spotting work? Well, where you look affects how you feel. So if you think about a specific memory and you look to your right, you're going to feel a lot different than when you look to the left. Okay? And so what we do is we use a tool called a pointer. And we will ask the client what they want to work on. So what's your name again, please?
Cesar.
Cesar. If I ask Cesar, please talk to me about something in particular you want to work on. And he tells me, oh, I was in a car accident or something, right? So,
To Venezuela.
so for instance, the Venezuelan crisis, right? And I'm going to use the pointer to guide the eye field to access the subcortical region of the brain where the trauma is held. So we can use different modalities. One of them is outside window, which is outside of the client's perception. And I'm going to hold the pointer in 3 different positions. So I'm going to ask you to look to your left, right, and you hold it for a second as you think about it. Okay? And you keep your eyes there. So I hold it for a few seconds, then I move it to the right. I hold it for a few seconds. And then to the right. Okay? Now, as I'm scanning, I'm looking for reflexes. And those reflexes are going to tell me when I'm accessing that because that's the healing response. So some people might twitch. Some people might blink fast. Some people, their eyes might wobble. Some people might start hyperventilating. It means that I'm reaching the subcortical region of the brain through the eye field where the trauma is held. And the next step is the processing. So the processing is the equivalent to the shaking on the antelope you saw on the video. How does it manifest? It's different from person to person. Some people might just sit there and blink.